Helen had always believed in the sanctity of her marriage to George. After 40 years together, she never imagined that the man she trusted most would betray her in the most devastating way. But on the night of his 70th birthday party, everything changed. What started as a surprise celebration quickly turned into a shocking revelation that would shatter their world. Helen discovered George's secret affair with a nurse named Leah. Now, as the truth comes to light, Helen must decide how to expose the man she once loved and the woman who threatened to take it all. It was a crisp fall morning when Helen Mitchell set the wheels in motion for what she hoped would be the most memorable surprise birthday party for her husband, George. She had spent weeks planning the event, poring over every detail to ensure it was perfect. George, now 70, had been the cornerstone of their family for decades, loving father, respected businessman, and doting husband. Their marriage, once filled with the excitement of young love, had evolved into a quiet, comfortable partnership over the years. Helen had always believed their bond was unbreakable, their life together a testament to love and loyalty. After all, they had been through so much together, raising 2 children, enduring life's ups and downs, and growing old side by side. Helen knew George well. He loved celebrations, especially those that involved family and friends. She imagined the look of surprise on his face when he entered the ballroom, filled with guests from every stage of his life, old friends, colleagues, even distant relatives who hadn't seen him in years. She was determined to give him a night he would never forget, a night that would celebrate everything they had accomplished together. But as the days passed and the event loomed closer, a small knot began to form in Helen's stomach. There was something about George's recent behavior that felt off. It started with small things: arriving home late from work, his phone glued to his side, his usual openness replaced with a distant, preoccupied air. Helen dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the pressures of work and the inevitable signs of aging. But then it became harder to ignore. George seemed distracted, almost preoccupied with something else when they were together. He was often too tired to engage in the evening conversations they once enjoyed, and when they did talk, he seemed absent, like his mind was elsewhere. The worst part was that Helen couldn't put her finger on what was wrong. She had tried asking him directly a few times, but he always brushed off her concerns with vague excuses: just work stuff, or the stress is getting to me, that's all. Yet, the more Helen observed, the more she wondered if there was something more to it. She didn't want to believe it, but a part of her feared that perhaps George wasn't the man she had thought he was. Still, she pushed these thoughts aside, determined not to let them ruin the excitement of the upcoming celebration. She wanted this to be a night to remember, not only for George but for the family and friends who would be coming together to honor him. She busied herself with last-minute preparations, reviewing the guest list, confirming the catering, making sure everything was just right. She even hired a photographer to capture the moments of joy, fully expecting it to be a picture-perfect evening. The night of the party arrived, and George was still oblivious to the surprise awaiting him. Helen watched him prepare, the same old George wearing his favorite suit and giving his usual charming smile to the mirror as he got ready. He was acting the part of the doting husband, even as Helen felt the dissonance in her heart. Guests began to fill the ballroom, chatting excitedly as the clock ticked closer to the moment George would walk in. Helen greeted everyone with warmth, ensuring they were all in place, and holding on to the hope that everything would go according to plan. She stood near the door, watching for George's arrival. She couldn't help but feel a strange unease growing within her, the feeling that something unexpected was just around the corner. As the evening unfolded, Helen found herself watching George more closely than she had intended. The party was in full swing, with laughter and chatter filling the ballroom, but a heavy weight settled on her chest. George seemed to be in his element, his charismatic self, as always, shaking hands with old friends and greeting family members with his trademark smile. But something about his interactions felt slightly off. He was more distant than usual, barely making eye contact with her, and when he did speak to her, it was brief and almost mechanical. Helen tried to dismiss the nagging sensation that had been growing in her gut. She was here to celebrate, after all, and she refused to let her suspicions ruin the night. But the more she observed him, the more uneasy she became. It was his interactions with Leah that stood out to her. Leah was one of the nurses George had started seeing more frequently due to his health issues, a woman he had often spoken about in passing. She was young, smart, and personable, qualities George had always admired in others. Helen had met Leah a few times at doctor's appointments, but tonight, Leah's presence felt different. The nurse seemed to gravitate toward George throughout the evening. Every time Helen turned around, Leah was standing beside him, laughing at something he said, or gently touching his arm. At first, Helen brushed it off as friendly banter, nothing unusual for a couple of old friends. But then she began to notice something more, something that made her stomach twist. There was a subtle intimacy in the way they interacted. Their laughter felt too warm, their glances too lingering. She watched as Leah reached out to adjust George's jacket at one point, her fingers brushing his collar in a way that seemed to stretch the boundaries of casual acquaintance. It was the kind of touch Helen had only seen between people who shared something deeper than friendship. A cold chill ran down her spine. Could it be possible? Could George be involved with Leah in a way that went beyond his health concerns? The thought seemed absurd at first, but the evidence was mounting. Helen began to observe their body language with even more intensity. George was laughing louder than usual, leaning in closer to Leah, sharing private jokes, while Helen stood at a distance, feeling like an outsider in her own marriage. As the night wore on, the discomfort in Helen's chest intensified. She tried to engage in conversations with other guests, but her mind kept drifting back to George and Leah. She was watching from the corner of the room when she saw them slip away from the crowd. It wasn't dramatic, but Helen couldn't help but notice how the two of them quietly excused themselves from the party and disappeared into a side hallway. Something about the way they moved, their quiet exit, seemed calculated. Helen's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She needed to know what was happening. Trying to calm her nerves, she decided to follow them. She moved through the crowd as inconspicuously as possible, the clinking of glasses and murmurs of conversation masking her footsteps. When she reached the hallway, she paused, hiding behind a column that offered a clear view of the door to the small conference room they had entered. She could hear the faint sound of their voices from the other side of the door. It was muffled, but the laughter was unmistakable. Helen's breath caught in her throat. There was no mistaking it now. The way George and Leah were speaking, soft, intimate, and full of affection, was nothing like the professional rapport she had seen between them at doctor's appointments. And then, just as Helen thought she might step forward to confront them, she heard it. A soft, low laugh, followed by a whispered word of endearment that made her blood run cold. Helen's worst fears were coming true. George wasn't just her husband. He was someone else entirely, someone who had built a secret life behind her back. And Leah, the nurse, was no innocent bystander. She was part of it. The realization hit Helen like a punch to the stomach. She had been blind to the truth, caught in the illusion of their perfect marriage, but now it was clear her husband had betrayed her, and the weight of that betrayal was crushing. For a moment, Helen stood frozen, listening to the sounds coming from the room. Her mind raced, and a rush of emotions overwhelmed her. Anger, disbelief, betrayal, but above all, an overwhelming sense of clarity. She couldn't let this go. She needed to confront George and Leah, but not yet. Tonight, the truth had to wait. There was no way she could expose their affair right here, in front of everyone at his surprise party. But Helen knew this was just the beginning. What would happen next would be far more public and far more devastating for George than anything he could have imagined. The days following George's birthday party felt like an endless blur to Helen. The shock of what she had witnessed on that night, the undeniable evidence of George's affair, seemed to settle into every corner of her mind. She couldn't escape the image of him with Leah, the whispered words of affection, the way they had disappeared from the party together. Her whole world had tilted off its axis, and she found herself drowning in a sea of confusion and disbelief. How had she not seen it? How had George kept this secret from her for so long? At first, Helen was paralyzed by the enormity of what she had discovered. She didn't know where to begin. The anger was sharp, and the pain of betrayal was all-consuming. But it was the confusion that hurt the most. She kept asking herself the same question over and over: why? What had led George to betray her in such a public, painful way? Were there cracks in their marriage she had never seen? Her mind raced as she tried to piece together any clue she might have missed. She scoured her memory, replaying every conversation, every moment she'd shared with George over the past few months. She began to realize that there had been signs all along, small things she had brushed off or written off as nothing. His growing distance, the late nights at work, the endless phone calls he'd always insisted were nothing important. But at the time, she had trusted him. She had believed him when he said nothing was wrong. Now, she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Helen's first instinct was to confront George directly. She thought of storming into the house, confronting him with the truth, laying bare everything she knew. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that an emotional confrontation would be the wrong move. She needed proof. Hard evidence that would leave no room for denial or excuses. She knew George well enough to understand that he would try to talk his way out of it, to manipulate the situation to make himself seem less guilty. She couldn't let him control the narrative any longer. So, she decided to investigate. It started with George's phone. Helen had never snooped through his things before, never questioned his privacy. But now, it felt like the only way to get to the heart of the matter. She waited until George left for work one morning, the house empty and silent. Then, she took a deep breath, picked up his phone from the counter, and unlocked it with the passcode she had known for years. Her hands shook as she began to scroll through his messages, searching for any clue that would confirm her suspicions. The messages were worse than she could have imagined. There were dozens of texts between George and Leah, many of them suggestive and intimate. The language between them was filled with affection, shared jokes, and plans to meet up. There were messages about dinner dates, secret meetings, and even plans to go away for the weekend. Some of the texts had come in after their anniversary, after George's birthday times when Helen had thought their marriage was as solid as ever. One message stood out above all the rest: "Can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you." It was signed with a heart emoji. Helen's heart clenched in her chest as she read it over and over. How had George been able to deceive her so completely? How had he kept this from her for months, all while living under the same roof? The anger that had been building inside of her finally erupted. Helen slammed the phone down onto the table, her hands trembling with fury. She felt betrayed on every level by George, by Leah, and by herself for not seeing the truth sooner. But amidst the rage, something else began to take shape in her mind. She wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to allow George to continue living his life as if nothing had happened. Helen knew that exposing the affair would tear their family apart, but she couldn't let this lie go unchecked. The truth had to come out, and it had to come out in the most public way possible. She wasn't going to suffer in silence anymore. It wasn't just about her marriage, it was about reclaiming her own life, her own dignity. She had spent years supporting George, caring for their family, believing in the sanctity of their bond. Now, it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. But before she could take action, Helen needed more than just the text messages. She needed proof that would be undeniable, that would show George's betrayal for what it truly was. So she began to follow him. Quietly, discreetly, she watched George as he went about his daily routine. She noted the times he would leave for work a little later than usual, the odd hours he would come home, his distracted manner whenever he was around her. Slowly, piece by piece, Helen built a detailed timeline of his affair, each moment of deceit, adding to the weight of the truth. As she sat in the silence of their home, Helen made a decision. She wasn't going to let George's betrayal destroy her. Instead, she would be the one to expose it, to show him that the truth was far more powerful than any lie he had built. She had the proof now, and she was ready to take the next step. Helen had spent days preparing herself for what was to come. The initial shock of discovering George's affair had slowly transformed into a burning desire for justice, not just for herself but for the life they had built together. She had painstakingly gathered proof, tracking George's every move, piecing together the timeline of his betrayal. It wasn't just the betrayal of her trust, it was the betrayal of everything they had shared: their children, their home, their history. Now she was ready to expose him, but she was determined to do so in a way that left no room for escape, no way for him to talk his way out of it. Helen knew George well. She had lived with him for over 40 years, and she understood his ego, his pride. He was a man who was used to control, used to being admired and respected. But in that moment, Helen realized that the one thing he had never expected was for her to turn the tables, to become the one in control. The thought of confronting him alone in their home, of exposing his affair in private, no longer seemed satisfying. It wouldn't be enough. He had to face the humiliation, the consequences, in front of everyone. She wanted to rip away the facade of their perfect life, to show their family and friends the truth behind the lies he had told them all. The idea came to her during one of her sleepless nights. George's 70th birthday had been a public event, a celebration meant to honor him. But what if the next event, the one she had secretly planned, could become the setting for his downfall? Helen could already hear the murmurs of disbelief in the room when she would reveal the affair. The shock and surprise of George's colleagues and friends as the truth came crashing down. She had been careful, biding her time. And now, with the second party just days away, she had everything in place. She reached out to the guests, those who had attended the birthday party and others she knew would be close to George, and quietly told them of the upcoming gathering. It would be a more intimate affair, but Helen made sure to position it as a way to celebrate George once again, as if nothing had changed. She would ensure George believed the party was for him, just as the first one had been. But behind the scenes, she was working toward a very different goal: to expose his secret. As the day of the event drew closer, Helen carefully planned her moment of revelation. She could already see it in her mind: George standing there, unaware of what was coming. The guests gathered around, talking, laughing, when she would stand and say, "There's something I need to show you all." She had already prepared the evidence, the messages, the photos, the timeline she had carefully constructed. Every piece of the puzzle had been laid out, each one more damning than the last. The night of the event arrived. George was his usual self, smiling, shaking hands, making small talk with friends and family. He seemed completely at ease, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Helen stood at the edge of the room, watching him, her heart racing. This was it. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment when everything would change. As George began his speech, thanking everyone for coming, Helen's pulse quickened. She could hear the pride in his voice, the way he spoke of his accomplishments and the life they had built. He was basking in the admiration of those around him, oblivious to the fact that the world was about to come crashing down. Helen stood, and the room quieted as all eyes turned toward her. For a split second, she felt a wave of fear, the realization of what she was about to do hitting her all at once. But she pushed it aside. This wasn't just about her. This was about taking back her dignity, her self-respect. She held up her phone, the images and messages displayed clearly for everyone to see. "George," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion inside her, "there's something you need to see." The room fell silent as the first message flashed across the screen: "Can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you." And then, more followed, texts about their secret meetings, their plans to spend weekends away. The laughter in the room faded as people leaned in, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. It was impossible to ignore. It was there, in black and white, a confession of deceit. George froze, his face draining of color. He looked from the phone in Helen's hand to the eyes of the guests around him, his usual confidence crumbling. The truth was out, and there was no denying it. Leah, who had been standing at the back of the room, suddenly found herself the center of attention. She glanced nervously between George and the group, her face flushed with embarrassment. Helen watched as George's carefully constructed world began to unravel. His posture slumped, and his eyes flickered with panic. He opened his mouth as though to say something, but no words came. It was too late. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no turning back. The faces of friends and family were filled with shock and disbelief, the weight of George's betrayal sinking in. For the first time in years, Helen felt a strange sense of triumph. She had done it. She had exposed the lies, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her power. The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of George's labored breathing. He looked as though he might collapse, his whole world slipping from his grasp. Helen knew the road ahead would be difficult. Her marriage was over, and their life together could never be the same. But in that moment, with the truth finally out, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had done what needed to be done. Now, it was George's turn to face the consequences. The aftermath of the party was nothing short of chaotic. George's world, which he had so carefully constructed, was shattered in an instant. The looks of shock and disbelief on the faces of their friends and family were still burned into Helen's memory. She had expected him to react, but not like this. He stood there, rooted to the spot, his face drained of color, unable to form coherent words. It was a stark contrast to the confident, well-spoken man everyone had known for so long. Helen watched as George's humiliation unfolded before her eyes. It was the quiet moments, the way he refused to meet anyone's gaze, the slumped shoulders, the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands that spoke volumes. He was a man completely out of control, utterly exposed, and there was nothing he could do to repair the damage. It was a kind of justice, the way he stood there, silently absorbing the consequences of his actions. For once, it was George who was powerless, and Helen who held all the cards. Leah, meanwhile, had retreated to the back of the room, her face flushed with a mix of guilt and embarrassment. She avoided eye contact with everyone, her discomfort palpable. The affair, which had once seemed so secret and hidden, was now out in the open, leaving Leah no place to hide. She had been George's partner in betrayal, but in the end it was Helen who had emerged as the stronger force. George's betrayal had been a shared secret between the two of them, but now, as Helen held the truth in her hands, it was clear that Leah was just another casualty of his deceit. Guests began to shuffle uncomfortably, unsure of what to say or do. Some looked at George with pity, while others exchanged knowing glances, their expressions tinged with anger and disbelief. For the first time in years, Helen could feel the weight of the room shift. She was no longer the passive wife, the one who had been in the dark about everything. She was the one in control, the one who had pulled back the curtain on George's lies and forced him to face the reality of his actions. It wasn't long before people started leaving, one by one, most of them too uncomfortable to stay in the presence of such an exposed, vulnerable George. Helen remained calm, her face steady, though inside, a wave of emotions crashed over her. She had done what she needed to do, but the path ahead was far from clear. The truth was out, but it didn't erase the hurt. It didn't take away the years of trust that had been broken. Helen knew that nothing would ever be the same again, that the life they had built together would now be reduced to a series of painful memories. The betrayal would stay with her forever. The next few days were a blur of awkward silences and tense conversations. George tried in vain to explain himself, but his words fell flat. He spoke of stress at work, of feeling disconnected, of not knowing how to communicate his feelings. But Helen didn't want to hear it anymore. She had heard it all before, the justifications, the excuses, the promises to do better. It was all hollow now. His words were meaningless. Helen knew that George was genuinely sorry, but that wasn't enough. Sorry didn't undo the damage. Sorry didn't erase the lies. She had given him everything: her love, her loyalty, her trust, and he had repaid her with betrayal. In some ways she felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of the secret had been lifted, but the pain of knowing the truth was still fresh. It would take time to heal, time to rebuild the parts of herself that had been shattered in the wake of George's infidelity. As for George, he spent the next several weeks attempting to salvage what little was left of their marriage. He went to counseling, read self-help books, and apologized at every turn. But Helen wasn't interested in his apologies anymore. The trust they had once shared was gone, replaced by the cold reality of the man he had become. She had given him every chance to prove himself, but now she realized that it was too late. Their separation came soon after. Helen moved out of the house they had shared for decades, taking the first steps toward rebuilding a life of her own. It was hard at first, living in the emptiness of an apartment that wasn't quite hers yet, but over time, she found a sense of peace. She joined a support group, reconnected with old friends, and slowly began to rediscover parts of herself she had forgotten. She wasn't just George's wife anymore. She was Helen, a woman who had endured unimaginable pain and had come out stronger on the other side. George, for his part, faced his own reckoning. His public humiliation was only the beginning. The affair had cost him more than just his marriage. It had cost him his reputation, his friendships, and perhaps most importantly, his own sense of self-worth. The man who had once been so confident, so sure of his place in the world, was now a shadow of his former self. He spent months trying to repair the relationships he had ruined, but the damage was too deep. He would never be able to undo the betrayal. For Helen, life slowly moved on. She had rebuilt her world piece by piece, and as time passed, the pain of the betrayal faded into a dull ache. She had learned the hard way that trust could be broken in an instant, but she had also learned that it was possible to survive, to rebuild, and to find strength in the face of betrayal. The truth had come out, and in the end, it had set her free.